This is The Conversation Weekly from The Conversation. Catastrophizing about an AI-dominated future has become the most human of pastimes.
Almost everybody I know who's an expert on AI believes that they will exceed human intelligence. It's just a question of when.
It's become the recurring nightmare. The end of humanity, ushered in not by pandemic, nuclear war or climate change, but by the machines. Or to be more precise, generative AI.
My worst fears are that we, the field, the technology, the industry, cause significant harm to the world.
I think there's a lot of attention on the big spectacular things that could happen if AI goes spectacularly wrong for us. But even if it doesn't go that way, even if we retain control of AI and it doesn't decide to run amok or turn the universe into paper clips or whatever the scenario you're concerned about is, it's still going to have effects on us, just much more mundane day-to-day effects.
This is Rob Brooks, a professor of evolution at the University of New South Wales in Sydney in Australia. He's been thinking about the way artificial intelligence could influence the future of humanity. The arrival of generative AI and large language models such as ChatGPT is already creating a new reality for humanity. At the moment, people are experimenting with these technologies, using them to find new ways of working and creating. But what if, over time, as we become more reliant on AI, our relationship with the technology shifts and turns into something parasitic? In this episode, we're exploring what AI could do to the evolution of our species, to human intelligence, to the way we interact with each other, and ultimately to the genes that we pass down to future generations. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. I'm joined for this episode by Signa Dean, Science and Technology Editor for The Conversation in Australia. Signa, welcome back to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Signa, today we're going to talk about evolution. And when I think about evolution, I always think about it as something that happens in the past, over thousands, millions of years even. It's not something I think about happening in the future and about how we're going to evolve.
Yeah, I think we don't think about evolution in the future tense. And I think that makes sense because, as you said, evolution, it's a long-term process. Species emerge and change, and it takes many, many generations to do so, particularly when you think about how long the human lifespan is, right? I think the process of evolution probably is best understood in hindsight when we see how things played out in the past. We can measure it and kind of track it. But I do think we can also use that hindsight to try and predict the future. It's just not an easy thing to do. There are just so many variables. That said, people are intrigued by the future evolution. That's definitely true. We want to know where we might end up as a species, and it's fun to speculate. I think that's why it's such a common trope in science fiction as well.
Exactly. And there are lots of researchers who are really thinking about our future in practical terms, grounded in evidence of what's happened in the past. And you've been working with one of them, the researcher Rob Brooks, who we had at the top of this episode. Tell us about Rob and his work.
So yeah, Rob Brooks is one of the foremost evolutionary biologists in Australia. He's won many awards for his popular science writing as well. And a couple of years ago, he wrote a book titled Artificial Intimacy, which explores human relationships and sexual behavior in light of modern tech, such as dating apps, sex robots, AI. And in my round, science and technology, we have been covering artificial intelligence lately from just so many different ways: development, controversies, regulation. But when Rob emailed us with his pitch, it was the first time someone proposed to tie it in with evolution. His title was, "It's time to think about how AI will alter the course of human evolution." And I think it's a great question to ask. As I said earlier, we are intrigued by our future, and right now it does feel like AI is everywhere. So shouldn't we consider what it might do to us as a species?
Absolutely. And we're going to hear more of the conversation that I had with Rob in a second. But before we do, can you remind us, Signa, because I think a lot of us maybe need a refresh from our biology lessons at school, how does evolution actually work?
Yeah, sure. It gets really complex, but I'll try to keep it basic. So all living things gradually change over time, and evolution is the name we have for this process. The key to remember here is that there's lots of variation in traits among individuals because our genes constantly mutate and often they do so randomly. So you just get a lot of little changes happening. So evolution unfolds by passing down those various traits from generation to generation. But that happens in response to various environmental pressures. Some of those traits will be better suited to surviving and therefore reproducing and making babies. So I do have a really simple example to kind of help illustrate that. Let's pick a random bird. It has 5 chicks. 2 of them happen to be born with green feathers and the rest are brown. Maybe in the forest where they live, green feathers can better hide you from predators. So the brown siblings get eaten, but the green ones survive to produce offspring with other birds. Maybe some of those birds then become green as well. So in the next generation, now you have, say, 4 green chicks out of 5. And they have better chances of surviving, right? The forest is green, they're good. Over time, you might get all green birds. The brown ones just get killed off. And, that's just a fact of life. So that's essentially an extremely simple way to describe evolution. Charles Darwin called that process natural selection. And it's also something that Rob Brooks notes as well. It's an extremely inefficient process, but it does work. It gets us where we are today. And it could get us to where we go in the future as well.
Well, thank you for that, Signe. I think it'll help as we hear Rob's future gazing into what AI could mean for the evolution of humanity. So thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you.
As Signe just explained, at its heart, evolution is about who survives to mate with who and what genes they pass on to the next generation. And so in his research as an evolutionary biologist, Rob Brooks has focused a lot on sex.
My background is actually in animal behavior. So I spent most of the early part of my career watching little fish, guppies, trying to mate and very occasionally mating, and catching crickets in graveyards at midnight and taking them back to the lab and studying how they invest in calling and eggs and all that kind of stuff. From an evolutionary point of view, I want to know about how sex, and especially the conflicts between mates and potential mates that are inherent to sex and make it so complicated, how they influence evolution. We like to paint this picture of sex as this kind of happy, friendly thing that happens, filmed in soft focus from far away with the sunset in the background kind of thing. But of course, we know that it's never like that. It's way more complicated. It's more sublime and it's more appalling from time to time. And that's just human sex. In the animal world, it's even more extreme than that.
Rob shifted his research to look more at human relationships, and he began to think a lot about the particular types of artificial intimacy that people can develop with machines or AI chatbots.
The capacity of machines to act as if they were humans and for people to treat them as if they were humans has been super interesting for me.
From there, Rob began thinking more broadly about how AI could affect the evolution of humanity, and so he wrote a research paper on it. One of the big questions when thinking about this is how the widespread use of artificial intelligence could affect human intelligence.
There's a couple of papers out this year that show that people in very knowledge-intensive jobs who are using ChatGPT are actually losing their critical thinking skills. Critical thinking is a muscle, and you need to exercise it in order to grow it. And so we're seeing that ChatGPT, in lifting some of the thinking from us, is actually having an effect on other areas of thinking that are important in knowledge and smarts and thinking intensive jobs in tech in particular.
But don't think of this as just a new AI-related problem. Rob says that this is an extension of a process that's been going on for thousands of years.
The defining feature of human evolution is that we went from grooming by picking at each other's fur, like other primates, to talking to each other. And in that talking to each other, we shore up our alliances and we become intimate. And that drove the evolution of language, but also drove the evolution of this incredible social brain that keeps track of who owes what to whom, who's related to whom, who dissed you last week, etc. And so that virtuous cycle of becoming more social, becoming linguistically more gifted, becoming more intelligent in order to keep track of all of that kind of stuff, incidentally gave us the capacity to do other things like complex mathematics and building AI eventually.
As humans evolved from primates, the size of our brains kept on growing, until about 30,000 years ago, when they stopped.
Human brains have been shrinking. So there's this very fast acceleration and sort of increase in brain size. And then 50 times quicker, brain size have been getting smaller. It's just that it's been happening for a shorter period of time. And we think that what's happened there is that instead of a smart person being somebody who can remember everything and can do everything, a smart person is now somebody who can fit in with the culture, and the culture holds all of that information. We have this shared cultural knowledge through stories and histories, and then writing comes along, and we are able to put down that burden for a period of time on a piece of paper and literally have the piece of paper carry that burden for us. And then we have the printing press, etc. very recently. All of these information technologies, as they have progressed and spread, they've relieved us of certain types of tasks. And that's meant that we've been able to sort of do other types of advanced tasks. But it also means that there's not quite as strong selection on brain size, because you don't need to have as big a brain to be just as smart, because your culture and some of the tools that you have in your culture are doing that for you.
There are also evolutionary advantages to having a smaller brain and a smaller head. It's easier for mothers and children to survive childbirth if they have to birth a smaller-headed baby, because of the sheer amount of energy needed and the potential complications.
We know that throughout history, about 10% of births have resulted in the death of the baby or the mother or both. And so you can imagine that a release from that, in which smaller brains aren't actually much inferior because of the cultural knowledge, means that selection isn't necessarily pushing brains to get any bigger, and as a consequence, they've got a bit smaller.
So what you're saying as well then, kind of where that might lead us, is that AI might make even more the workload of the brain unnecessary, because there's this other tool that could be used to do complex mathematics or remember facts. How could that then affect the way we think or the way our brains are used?
I mean, I think it's really hard to anticipate, and it requires a more vivid imagination than mine. But we do know that we tend to repurpose in a limited way parts of our brain for other purposes that become more important. Now that we have machines doing the differential equations and predicting the future and the remembering birthdays and even some of the conversation for us, and in the case of dating apps, potentially doing the early stages of courtship for us, we may find that there are other things that we can't even imagine yet that become important. And so maybe what we'll find is that those parts of the brain that we're able to let rest, hopefully we'll be able to use them for other purposes, because it would be nice to see people being happy.
Rob's been thinking a lot about how the relationship between humans and machines, including AI, mirrors what happens in the animal kingdom. It's useful here to think about what are called symbiotic relationships between different species, where one depends on or is linked in some way to another.
We have a lot of symbioses. Organisms don't live in a vacuum. They live often in very, very close association with other organisms.
Now, there are a few different ways symbiosis can work. One is called mutualism.
Mutualisms are often these tightly evolved relationships in which you really depend on each other.
For example, many types of ants have a mutualistic relationship with aphids. The aphids suck the sap from plants and produce a sugary waste called honeydew. The ants eat it and in return protect the aphids from predators. Rob thinks this mutualism is a useful way to think about humans' relationship with technology.
The reason we have the technologies that we have is that they prove themselves useful. And so the idea of that technology spreads. So it could be the plough. Somebody figures out that you could get a cow to drag a blade through the earth, and suddenly a week's work is done in a day. And so they tell their friends about it, and their friends go, I'm going to get a blade and get my cow to drag it through the earth. And then every development in terms of refining the plough is information, cultural information, and it evolves. But the technology also spreads, and suddenly we are working with ploughs. And similarly, we benefit because work is a whole lot easier. And so a lot of the things that AI does for us at the moment are incredible sort of computational heavy lifting. It could be difficult calculations, or it could be remembering people's birthdays. Nobody has a birthday calendar on the back of the toilet door anymore. there's a kind of mutualism. Most of our relationships with technology should be mutualisms because that's kind of why we have the technologies.
But there's another type of symbiosis in nature, one that's a bit more malevolent, called parasitism.
Where one harms the other whilst benefiting for itself. So like mosquitoes sucking your blood, etc., or malaria parasites being transmitted and causing disease and using our bodies to replicate.
In the living world, these relationships between species aren't static. What was once a mutually beneficial relationship can morph into something else. And the same can be true for technology.
So there are technologies that are also becoming parasitic because they themselves are evolving via cultural evolution, not genetic evolution. And it's actually in the interest of the people that make and sell them to us to do things that incidentally harm us.
Rob believes that smartphones have already become parasitic.
Since the start of smartphones, we see this huge increase in time spent on phones. But what that's cutting into is time spent with family, time spent with human friends, doing human friend stuff the way that we would have conceived it pre-2010, and sleeping. And it seems that a lot of the rise in youth self-harm and mood disorders is one of the consequences. And so that's a very definite parasitic relationship in that there's something that we have an association with that's basically draining a resource, our attention and our time, and it's coming at a huge cost and a fitness cost, a literal fitness cost. This is where evolution is probably already happening in response to technologies, including AI-based technologies.
When you say it's already happening, in what ways do you think it's already happening?
People who wouldn't have otherwise died are dying, unfortunately, due to self-harm and mood disorder type of things. People who would have normally been finding partners, having sex and having babies are not doing that at the same rate, because the other consequence for that generation who's grown up with smartphones is that they appear to be less interested in dating, in mating, less inclined to sexual experimentation, and less inclined to long-term partnerships and having kids. And there's a whole discourse about why people aren't having kids, but it would seem to be that this may be part of it. I wouldn't say that it's the main driver, because there's all sorts of reasons that people have for not having kids, and that's understandable. But all it has to do is it just has to shift who it is that's doing the reproducing, who it is that's living and dying long enough to reproduce. And as a consequence of that, you'll have genetic changes.
Okay. And bring AI and chatbots into that. What impact could that continue to have on social relationships, and then also for human evolution of those social relationships?
Well, the chatbots are, again, just another distraction from being social. And you go, well, that's fine. They're feeding the same impulse. You feel better because you've chatted to your chatbot friend. But friendships are for something. They have a function. Historically, that function has been to have people around you who have your back when something goes wrong. Perhaps when you're under physical threat, but more likely when disaster strikes. People who are going to look out for you and people you can look out for. Every culture has this. And if you're spending all of your social time and all of your social energy chatting to something that's basically lives in a server somewhere on the other side of the planet, it's not going to have your back when those things happen. It's not going to materially be able to drive you out of a burning neighborhood. Or obviously more day-to-day things that happen to us all the time. It's not going to recognize that you're sick and your kid needs to be dropped off at daycare. And without those kinds of alliances and cooperative exchange and tit for tat, people might find themselves in much more difficult circumstances.
You've got this longer term trend of people, as humans have evolved, of them being social animals, working in groups, having communities, but actually AI could kind of reverse that. We'd be a bit more solitary, we'd have fewer friends, and that's something that could actually happen much more quickly in terms of evolution.
Well, I think to begin with, the ecological response, the sort of here and now response, and I think absolutely we can already see a signature of that happening, but there will also downstream be genetic consequences, because it will affect which individuals live and which die, etc. And maybe that your susceptibility to AI friendship is something that's going to be very strongly selected for or against, depending on the circumstances. It could be very strongly selected for, because unless you have a bunch of AI friends who can vouch for you, you'll never be able to get a home. Like, that's a kind of silly example you might come up with, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility. It might be that unless you can resist chatting to these characters, you're never going to get anything done, and you're just going to end up being a zombie who's entertained.
And you're never going to meet and interact with and have babies with prospective partners.
Exactly, yes.
So far, we've been talking about more gradual ways that human evolution could be influenced by AI. But even if we leave aside the prospect of the killer robot AI apocalypse, there are some pretty direct and dramatic ways that AI could affect the course of human evolution. And that's through the use of AI-assisted technologies in fertility treatments.
So the first thing is just the very spread of fertility treatments alone. Should they reach a critical threshold globally, or in isolated pockets where, let's say, more than half of children are being born due to some kind of assisted fertility situation, then what you might expect is that any genes that might make you more disposed to conceiving and carrying to term a fetus in that way, those genes, they're already spreading, because there's a lot of fertility treatment out there. And I don't think we're there yet, but we're probably on the threshold of being able to pick up an evolutionary signature of that. Then, of course, the other big technology of the moment is CRISPR gene editing, and the possibility for some kind of more directed evolution so that you can edit things at the embryo stage.
CRISPR gene editing allows scientists to cut and paste parts of DNA. In 2018, a Chinese scientist claimed that he'd used the technique on embryos that resulted in the birth of twin girls. He was globally condemned and spent time in prison for illegally practicing medicine. One obvious advantage might be if AI and AI tools were used in some way to select embryos, or in some way to, as you say, to do CRISPR gene editing, would be that it would stop children being born with the genes for certain diseases. There are lots of unintended consequences that could happen here, and it starts to look a bit like eugenics. So what are the risks?
The problem I have with that is access to it. And it sort of gels with the human enhancement kind of literature, in which you can have an Elon Musk talking about Neuralink, but what you really mean is Neuralink to enhance people like Elon Musk, to enhance people who might have the skills or the interests or the family connections that actually matter, or the money to do that. And so I think with gene editing, it's the same kind of thing. We could talk about optimizing human development, and there's all sorts of inadvertent downsides to that philosophers and bioethicists have been thinking really deeply about for a very long time. But should you do that, what are we really optimizing for? It's easy when it's like there's a gene and it causes some nasty disease that kills people by the age of 25. It's very easy to say, look, that's a gene we should probably get rid of. But we now have AI, which is really good at optimizing things in huge numbers of dimensions all at once. Let's let AI pick the best embryo with all of these different traits weighted. It's a long way away technically, but it's something that I'm super concerned about, because the nature of that optimization, I don't think we even understand what that means.
As Rob says, AI-enhanced fertility treatments picking embryos for questionably optimistic traits. This feels very far away technically, and very far away from being acceptable to most humans currently alive today. But who knows what the future may hold, or the paths humans will be forced down. Final question then, Rob. You're an evolutionary biologist, so you often think in terms of millennia, not in terms of even a decade or 100 years. So if we're really going to see changes to humanity and the way either we act as social beings or more concrete things about our physical appearance, this is not going to be immediate. It's going to take a long time.
No. The thing about evolution is it happens no matter what. But the problem with evolution is, of course, that there's a whole lot of dying and suffering along the way. And it's the dying and the suffering along the way that's a concern of mine. It may be that it's simply chatting to AI bots allows people to be sort of brave new world happy, but not really go on to reproduce it all. And you go, well, maybe that's not necessarily such a bad scenario compared to some of the others that are possibilities. But there are lots of ways in which AI could learn to engage us, especially socially, in ways that make us happy in the short term, but really unhappy in the long term.
Well, thank you so much, Rob, for kind of doing a bit of that future gazing for us with the knowledge of what's happened before. We appreciate your insights into it, and I guess we'll all have to wait and see what happens.
Well, great fun chatting to you, Gemma. So thank you very much for having me on.
That's it for this week's episode. It was written and produced by me, Gemma Ware, with help from Mend Marawani. Mixing and sound design is by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. Stephen Kahn is our global executive editor. You can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts to help you make better decisions. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks very much for listening.